Now, after what is it now? We're probably closing in on 1.4 million casualties that the Russians have taken. And you're going to tell the Russian people, nah, you know what? We didn't get it all. We didn't get that. We got part of it. Got part of it. Yay, we got part of it. But we didn't even get all of the nuts. You think Putin's going to sell that to the Russian people? You think he might sell it to some of them who are just tired of all this crap and just want it to stop? But he's got a lot of people who have taken the economic hardship, who have lost friends, who have lost family, who have been killed on the idea that this was for some greater Russia. And it turns out being an incomplete job, and an incomplete job, by the way, in which Russia is still boxed in and largely isolated. So no, I think uh, I've always assessed the fact that this was going to be Putin's legacy. This was his legacy project, and you don't leave a legacy incomplete. He either succeeds or he goes down fighting till the last point where he can afford to fight.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes, and we are again joined by Scott Lucas, Professor of US and International Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute, and also, of course, the founder and editor of EA Worldview. Scott, thanks very much for coming back.
Hey, what better way to get into the holidays than having one more go at Frontline before we go celebrate Christmas?
Well, indeed. I think Russia have been trying their best to make sure we're all working through the holidays, but perhaps there's going to be a break now. Big development on Monday. A Russian general has been blown up pretty much in Moscow, pretty centrally. That's going to rattle the Kremlin, one would think.
Yeah, it is rattling Kremlin. I think that while there will be a military significance, when you lose one of your top military commanders, it does have an effect. I think that psychological effect is also, although Ukraine has not claimed responsibility for this yet, I think it's almost certainly Ukraine military or state security services, and they're trying to rattle the Kremlin at a time when Russia, of course, continues to try to break Ukraine with the aerial, with the ground attacks, and when Vladimir Putin keeps blustering, as he did for 4 hours last Friday, that Russia is going to win this and is going to seize more territory. The general in this case is Fanil Savarov. He was head of the operational training directive of the Russian military. That's the unit that oversees the combat training and readiness. So it prepares everyone for going to the front lines in Ukraine. He had been involved in the invasion of Ukraine before he took up that post, and he had been involved in Russian wars on Chechnya and Russia's military intervention to prop up the Assad regime in Syria. So he's got a great deal of experience, but he is the third general to have been killed in the last year. So it's not like this is a sudden vulnerability. This is an ongoing vulnerability. After the second assassination, which took place earlier this year, Vladimir Putin said this is unacceptable. We have to make sure it doesn't happen again. Well, it has. And again, they got to the car in which he was riding. They got an explosive device underneath it. It detonated a few seconds after the car started to roll, reportedly out of a courtyard or out of a parking garage. And, every Russian military commander is going to be thinking, okay, wait, better double check my security, better think about what's going on here. And Vladimir Putin, he'll keep blustering, but you got to think there's a thought in his head that the combination of this with Ukraine's ongoing attacks on Russian military installations, including oil refineries, including logistics depots, including petrochemical plants, including naval bases. Several Russian tankers have been blown up in recent days. And in combination with Russia's economic problems, you got to think, maybe, does this give Putin just a flutter that at some point he's going to have to row back from his attempt to conquer his neighbor?
Indeed. And, there's been another weekend of talks around the idea of peace proposals or ceasefires and another Russian rejection. Should we have expected anything else out of Moscow at this point?
Absolutely not. I mean, and I'm sorry, every time someone talks about a peace plan, which was the peace plan that was devised by Donald Trump's envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, with Vladimir Putin's financial point guy, Kirill Dmitriev. That makes me laugh. And when the Americans keep saying, well, that peace is just around the corner, it makes me issue another black comedy laugh. And I got to say, it's black comedy laugh because that the Russians tonight, the night after this, the night after that, are going to fire their missiles and their drones in. And for those who think that it was going to turn out any other way, let's talk about what Vladimir Putin has said in recent days. A few days ago, last week, Putin and the Kremlin are very unsettled that Ukraine did not accept the ultimatum that they fashioned with the Trump folks. And you might remember that ultimatum was for Ukraine to give up more territory, including all of the Donetsk region in the east of the country. It was for Ukraine to accept permanent weakness, political military weakness, no membership in NATO, strict restrictions on Ukraine's military forces, on Western aid. The U.S. takes profits out of the fund that's meant to be for Ukraine's recovery. Well, Europe and Ukraine pushed back on that, issued their own counter proposals, and they've succeeded in getting inside the Trump administration, with some people supporting those, to the point where they were able, after last week's talks in Berlin, to get security guarantees. The first time you've gotten U.S. involvement in security guarantees in a meaningful plan. So what does Putin do? Does he say, oh, that's it, we have to negotiate, we've got to resolve this, we've got a ceasefire? Absolutely not. He says the Europeans are Nazi piglets. Now, you can conjure up the image of what a Nazi piglet looks like, but it's a Nazi piglet that is supporting a Nazi regime. So he was restating the demands. Indeed, he said, we will take Donetsk by negotiation or by force. And again, effectively saying, we don't even recognize the Zelensky government as being legitimate. We don't recognize Europe as having a legitimate role here. So if he's not going to recognize that Europe and Ukraine have a legitimate position in talking about their security, as he would in terms of talking about Russian security, you don't get a ceasefire. Now, where we stand right now is there were 3 days of talks between Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, with the Ukrainians on one side, and then with Kirill Dmitriev, their buddy, who had flown from Moscow, on the other side. The Ukrainian delegation was there to talk terms. And there are 3 issues, Louis, if you don't mind me spelling these out, that Zelensky has identified. Interestingly, it's not security guarantees. So Zelensky's letting it be known, we're happy with the security guarantees the Europeans have proposed, which includes US-led air power. Issue 1, territory, Donetsk region. Issue 2, control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. The Americans want to split control between the Russians and themselves and Ukraine. Good luck on how that's going to work out. And Ukraine saying, no, this is our plant. We have sovereignty. I do think Ukraine might consider the International Atomic Energy Agency coming in and running the plant, but Ukraine's not going to give up sovereignty on it. And thirdly, reconstruction, which is, no, we're not going to have the U.S. take profits from other fund, which is for our reconstruction. That's for us, right? And Russia's not going to get its frozen assets back. An issue which has played out on the European Union scene in the past few days. So they've set that out, right? And they send their high-ranking delegation of that. Now, Moscow sends out Kirill Dmitriev. There's no other real senior officials with Dmitriev. It's not like there's a senior delegation. So as veteran Russian watchers have pointed out, Dmitriev's not there to negotiate. Dmitriev is there to send a message from Moscow. Now, what was that message at the end of this? No details in terms of what was discussed comes out. Witkoff and the Ukrainians give out the exact same message about productive and constructive discussions, blah, 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 blah. Witkoff gives out a message about productive and constructive discussions with the Russians, however, and he says, Russia wants a genuine peace in Ukraine. And everybody looks at that, who knows anything about Ukraine, goes, wait a minute, they're bombing the hell out of Ukraine, and Witkoff's still saying they want a genuine peace. Kirill Dmitriev trolls everybody on social media and says, enjoyed Florida, see you in Moscow. In other words, we're going to get Witkoff and possibly Jared Kushner back to Moscow. We're going to try to spin them again, bring them back onto our ports. Now, which way do these boys break, and which way does the Trump administration break? And now you have an almighty struggle which is going on. And if you don't mind, I'll give you 2 pieces of evidence that we looked at, one past, one present. Wall Street Journal came out with a heck of an article this week where they went back and they just dug into how the Kremlin manipulated Witkoff. And I think I need to tell you the story because it just cuts to the chase. Everybody wants to know, why is he so dogma and pro-Kremlin? At the start of the Trump administration, the Kremlin had psychological profiles on Trump's advisors. Now, Keith Kellogg was supposed to be the envoy to Ukraine and Russia. Witkoff was supposed to have the Middle East brief. But the Russians knew, or at least learned, that Kellogg's daughter, Megan Mobbs, is the head of a charity in Ukraine. Kellogg had also told Tucker Carlson, Trump's friend and the demagogue, when Tucker said, "Oh, you should go to Moscow and go talk to him immediately," and Kellogg told him where to go, right? So Moscow's thinking, we don't want this guy on point. They looked at Witkoff and they thought, real estate developer, guy who's interested in business deals. Let's see what we can do here. They make an offer they send a message to the Trump administration via the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. And it comes from Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's point guy. Vladimir Putin would like to meet Steve Witkoff in Moscow. And if Witkoff comes to Moscow, Putin may release the teacher, Mark Foley, an American who was being held on drugs charges. But one condition: Witkoff cannot come with any American personnel. No CIA, no State Department, not even an interpreter. Mark Foley was released. And you might remember the infamous clip of Steve Witkoff in the Kremlin with an interpreter who was provided by the Russian intelligence services. At the same time, in April, that Witkoff goes to St. Petersburg and Moscow, Kirill Dmitriev draws up the plans for joint U.S. economic projects. Boom. And of course, those will be the same joint U.S. economic projects with Russia that Dmitriev dangles at the end of October when they devise the ultimatum. So, do I think there's any chance that we get Ukraine having a defense of its interests through Witkoff? Maybe not, but here's the other half of the story, Louis. A couple days ago, people within the U.S. intelligence services, or who have access to U.S. intelligence services, go to Reuters and they go, you know what? We've got a series of intelligence assessments that Vladimir Putin doesn't want a ceasefire. In fact, Vladimir Putin still is maintaining his aims in this conflict. He wants to conquer Ukraine, and he would like to reclaim areas in Europe that used to be part of the Soviet Union. Think Moldova, for example, and think about all the Russian, whatever you want to call it, hybrid warfare, right? The cyber attacks, the sabotage attacks, the drone and fighter jet overflights that have been taking place in Europe in the past few weeks. They leaked this. U.S. intelligence leaks this. Now think, why would they leak this at this point? They want to get that message out there. This guy is not to be trusted. This led to a firestorm, at least for 24 hours, because Tulsi Gabbard, who is nominally the head of U.S. intelligence, she's the director of national intelligence, but who has been parroting Kremlin lines for years, gets onto social media, says, this is a horrible article. This is just complete with falsehoods and so on. This is part effectively of the deep state trying to drag the United States into war, right? This is part of NATO and the EU trying to pull us in. So she's trashed NATO and the European Union. And so did at the same time a guy named Michael Flynn, a former general who used to be Trump's national security advisor in 2017, who's a conspiracy theorist who wants martial law in the United States. You got the adults in the room in US agencies who do not want to give way to Putin. But then you've got people like Tulsi Gabbard, and then you've got to think, Witkoff and Kushner, which way do they break? How much influence do they have? How much is J.D. Vance messing around behind the scenes when he said over the weekend at the big turning point, basically hard right fest, white nationalist fest, to be honest with you, and where he says, American people want money here. They want money for themselves. They don't want it going to Ukraine. How much has JD really bought into that? How much is JD behind that idea that Ukraine effectively should just give way so you can get those economic deals with the Russians?
Indeed, and I'm interested as well in some of the language we've heard coming out of the Kremlin in the last week. We mentioned earlier, of course, Putin in his big end of year address or interview or address to the nation, talking about calling the Europeans pigs. But at the same time, there are a couple of other terms in there, especially about when referring to the Donbass, talking about Russia wanting to retake historical territories. That's an interesting term for Russia to use, isn't it? Because it doesn't just apply to the Donbass in Putin's mind, or at least it hasn't in the past.
That's red flag. That's the red flag that the U.S. intelligence agencies would point to, because when you talk about historical territories, Kremlin has used that not only to refer, quite rightly, as you talk about, to the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, what we call the Donbass. They're talking about almost that whole entire area along the Black Sea in southern Ukraine, all the way across to Odessa, right? And indeed, there have been threats by the Russians repeatedly, which is, if you don't give way to us now, we're going to take Odessa. And not just from Dmitry Medvedev when he's had a bad night. It's come from other officials connected to the Kremlin as well. At the very least, when Putin says we're going to get those historical territories by negotiation or by force, take him at his word here, folks. He's not going to settle for a ceasefire on the current lines, that 19% of Ukraine, and he can't afford to settle on this. Okay, so let's cut to the chase here. You've told the Russian people for well over a decade, when you've been trying to split Ukraine, we're going to get back these areas. You've especially told them that with a full-scale invasion. You've told the Russian people, this is what you're sacrificing for. The euphemism, special military operation, blah, blah, blah. We're getting this territory back for you. Now, after, what is it now? We're probably closing in on 1.4 million casualties that the Russians have taken. And you're going to tell the Russian people, nah, you know what? We didn't get it all. We didn't get that. We got part of it. Yay, we got part of it. But we didn't even get all of Donetsk. You think Putin's going to sell that to the Russian people? You think he might sell it to some of them who are just tired of all this crap and just want it to stop? But he's got a lot of people who have taken the economic hardship, who have lost friends, who have lost family, who have been killed on the idea that this was for some greater Russia. And it turns out being an incomplete job, and an incomplete job, by the way, in which Russia is still boxed in and largely isolated. So no, I think, I've always assessed the fact that this was going to be Putin's legacy. This was his legacy project. And you don't leave a legacy incomplete. He either succeeds or he goes down fighting till the last point where he can afford to fight.
And yet, there doesn't seem to be any clear or apparent method by which the Russians can militarily take that territory. There is, of course, still a level of advance that the Russian military has been going on with, but there seems to be more of a tactic developing here, doesn't there, of taking small settlements or smaller advances and then using that as an attempt to sort of prove that Russia has the initiative. But is that working, Scott? Because we do still hear the White House saying Russia's the one winning the war, Russia's the one, moving forwards.
Yeah.
No one else seems to be buying that, and it doesn't seem to be enough to bring everyone around the table yet. Or are the Russians just going to keep chipping away at this until they get what they want?
Well, I think we need to go at different levels here. If you're talking about the serious military level, from the reading of it, you're talking about Donetsk, and the fact is that the Russians have made gradual advances in Donetsk. But, and indeed, I think they may have claimed the small town of Seversk, which has about 11,000 people, but they still haven't taken Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk, they've been trying to take Pokrovsk, which is the logistics hub in the east. They've devastated it. It's no longer a logistics hub. It has no functional value at this point because they're leveling it. But they've been trying to occupy it for 17 months. And you may remember that Putin, a couple of weeks ago, tried to say, oh yeah, we've got it. We've claimed it. And a Russian soldier runs up with a flag and waves it for a bit. And then it turns out, well, no, the Ukrainians are still fighting. So, that would be serious if they broke through the lines there. But even if they took Pokrovsk, and even if they took the nearby town to it, that doesn't break the lines that are taking place. Now, they are probing in Zaporizhia down in the south, and they've taken a few villages down there. But again, not a major advance which has taken place there. Look, if the Russians gradually advance, they take Donetsk, they take Zaporizhia maybe in 5 years. But, they're counting on the Ukrainian lines to break at some point. And the fact here is that we may talk about this in just a minute. If Europe bailed out on Ukraine and did not support Ukraine, you might see that sign of, well, Christ, that's it. Ukraine just can't hold out. But the EU did step up last week. In terms of the second level of this, what the Russians are trying to do is to use claimed operations to try to spin the Americans. And you've absolutely summarized it. So what they've done in the past couple of days is that they've claimed to take a couple of villages in Kharkiv in the northeast of the country. And then their latest stunt was to do a cross-border raid into the Sumy region. They went into one of the villages near the border with Sumy. And this is the serious aspect of this, they lifted 50 residents who had not evacuated, most of them elderly, and they just pulled them, right? They effectively abducted them. But what the Russians were doing is they were going into this village, they were occupying it for a bit of time, and then they leave, right? But they present it as this great, glorious advance. And it's entirely to feed the narrative of the camp that is sympathetic to the Kremlin to get into Donald Trump's ear and go, Ukraine doesn't have any cards, right? But we come back to this, and you've stated this right. Look, what has been established is two things. One is there are some people in the U.S. administration that don't buy the Russian narrative. And I'm talking about career officials mainly. And I suspect to an extent Marco Rubio. They don't buy that Russian narrative. And more importantly, the Europeans have not given way to that narrative. And European intelligence services have been pretty much on top of their game, not just in terms of assessing what's happening, but letting the media know where they stand on this. Now, there is a flutter here, which I will mention, which I'm going to leave it for our good folks, our good commenters to come in on this. There is a flutter as to why Emmanuel Macron said he's willing to meet Putin now, right? And we have to keep eyes on this over the holiday period. Is Macron, I don't think Macron's making a break from the European line. I don't think he would be doing it. I would hope he isn't doing it just for domestic reasons, but is Europe using Macron to signal to Putin, look, I think the logical explanation for this is an attempt to tell Putin, you need to accept the ceasefire now, son. You need to expect this. And you need to accept a security arrangement in which, look, your security is, quote, guaranteed because we're not going to invade you. And newsflash for all our good friends who are going to jump in on the timeline. No, NATO and the EU were never planning to invade Russia. But Ukraine needs to get its security guarantees. And that includes, by the way, if we're speculating on why Macron's going there, that includes European troops in Ukraine for those security guarantees. So we're a little bit ahead of ourselves. That's probably what comes up in 2026, because before that, the Kremlin's going to roll the dice again. And that is Dmitriev's message, I'll remind you, on social media, which was when he says, see you in Moscow. That was, I will see Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner in Moscow. And let's see if they show up with other officials this time, or if they just show up on their own and let the Russians provide the translator. He's just hopeless. I'm sorry. We will remind you, he is the purported envoy and esteemed real estate developer, Steve Witkoff, and that is what he is always going to be.
Indeed, it's an interesting thing to keep observing these going back and forth. But you mentioned there, of course, the support provided by the European Union, that 90 billion euros that have been provided to Ukraine. They've come out of bonds. It's not as big as the package Ukraine might have hoped for, but that number does seem to fit to be enough to at least get Ukraine through 2026, doesn't it?
Well, it's 2/3 of what they need through 2027. And so the estimate, they needed 135 billion. And it was kind of neat. One of the reasons why they were going for the reparations loan option drawn from the frozen assets is it kind of worked out quite neatly. And that is, look, Ukraine needs 135 billion. We've got 210 billion of Russian assets here. You take about 2/3 of the Russian assets that we've got, that works out at 135. And then, of course, Belgium stood in the way of that. And, I won't go into the details of why Belgium stood in the way to it, but they just weren't simply going to budge. And at that point where they're not going to budge, it's like, okay, now, and this was, this is a serious thing, because it's like, if the EU cannot provide the financial support for Ukraine, because all of Ukraine's taxes goes to its military, How do you keep, transport, education, healthcare, other essential public services? How do you protect the Ukrainian public when Russia's trying to bomb all those services out of existence? And Ursula von der Leyen flagged up a couple weeks ago. So this wasn't entirely out of the blue. She flagged up the option, which was, look, we'll take 90 billion from the frozen Russian assets, and we'll take 45 billion. We'll borrow it against the markets. Right? And what was interesting is that we got into this would have been last Friday, when the rubber hits the road, and Belgium's not going to budge, and it was quite clear. And you've got to say that the EU worked over the next 24 hours. And it was like, we are going to, and Antonio Costa, the European Council President, European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen said, we're not leaving here till we get a deal. We'll stay through the weekend. And the story is, and this is an interesting part of it, supposedly Italy, with Giorgia Meloni, the prime minister. See, it wasn't, let me back up a step. This is how serious it had gotten. The Russians, of course, are threatening Belgium. If you let them use our frozen Russian assets, we're going to bring hell down on you. We're going to do it legally. We're going to sue Everclear. But they also were threatening individual officials, right? And then the Trump administration was threatening Europe, saying, we'll get this money back if you take these Russian assets. The reason why the Trump administration is doing this, by the way, is if Europe gets the Russian assets, you can't use the Russian assets for joint US-EU projects or joint US-Russian projects. Right, so they're in the middle of all this, and the Americans were leaning on Giorgia Meloni. This is one I want to bring that up, right? And so Italy was like, we're not sure if we can go with the reparations loan. Meloni was very quiet during the first day, the Thursday, and then on the Friday she starts to intervene, and she supposedly is the person that brings the sides together to say, look, we're going to agree on the 90 billion loan on the capital markets. Now, for Giorgia Meloni to do that shows an element of pragmatism within the EU in terms of what needs to, remembering that she's hard right. She's a hard right politician who Trump thought was going to be one of theirs. The other thing to mention out of this is that the EU, again, made sure that this decision didn't have to be unanimously approved. So not all 27 members had to sign on. And so, Putin's friends within the EU, Hungary's Viktor Orban, Slovakia's Robert Fico, what are you going to do about them? What are you going to do about the new leader of Czechoslovakia, Babiš? At the end of the day, they're allowed to say, oh, we're not going to contribute any money to this 90 billion. So they can go back to their domestic populations and go, we don't support this, blah, blah, blah. And the EU says, fine, the other 24 of us are. I don't want to, look, I don't want to over dramatize this. This isn't, because it's not going to end the Russian invasion. It's not going to be the final resolution that you need to support Ukraine. But for the EU to be able to pull this together is a sign of continued resolve behind Ukraine. And that's a big moment. It's a moment that has sort of come and gone, but it's a big moment because it gives Ukraine that space as we go into 26. And you know it, and you know why it succeeded. Louis, you know why it succeeded, because that's why Putin was so pissed off this week. That's why he thought, we got them. They're not going to support us. They're going to come out weak. And when they didn't, that's when he comes up with that Nazi piglets line, and his officials as well, who said, Europe shouldn't have anything to do with this. Well, guess what, son? They're there. And I will emphasize, by the way, it's not just Europe, but there are other countries who have stepped it up in recent weeks as well, such as Canada. And I think what has been impressive is that caught between the determination of Vladimir Putin to seize another country and between the unpredictability and chaos of many of the people in the Trump White House, Ukraine still stands and Europe still stands behind it.
And just to finish then, Scott, this sort of, merry-go-round of diplomats from Russia and the US meeting each other, trying to agree on something, someone turns it down. That's not likely to be over even by Russian Christmas, is it? How likely is that to pretty much define the war in Ukraine for 2026 as well?
This doesn't end until the Russian economy gets to be so bad that Putin decides he can't keep prosecuting the invasion. I mean, that's where it's going to be. Now, how bad does it have to get, the Russian economy, before he decides that? That is the question that I don't think anyone here can answer. But, Ukraine cannot regain the territory that Russia already occupies in in the country. So it's not going to resolve that way. On the other hand, as we've just explained, as long as Europe's behind Ukraine, unless you get a whole series of European governments that are toppled from within, and that you have probably far right or far left governments that refuse to support Ukraine, unless that happens, then Europe continues to stand. So where do you come out of this? And you come out of it in terms of exhaustion. Now Ukraine's pretty tired, but the thing about Ukraine is, and if you folks don't know this by now, and if Putin doesn't know it by now yet, they are resilient. Geez, I mean, they are resilient. The fact of the matter here is the vast majority of Ukraine still do not want to give in to the Russians. I know that from personal experience as well. So that means, when does Russia get exhausted? You know, and all I can say to you here is that I'll put it down here that I think one reason why the Russians are stepping up their attacks and are stepping up all the psychological stuff to try to break Ukraine, and why they're stepping up the pressure on the Americans, is I think you look at a 6-month window, maybe 6 to 12 month window. And if we get to this point next spring and they still haven't broken Ukraine, because I'll just close with this. Mark Rutte said, Russia has 140 million people. We've got 1 billion, right, in Europe. But it's not just 1 billion. Australia, Canada, Japan, South Korea, countries such as that also are supporting that effort. Russia is relatively isolated. And again, for our friends, our pro-Kremlin friends who come into the comments, you come back at me and you tell me who stands with Russia in this invasion. Maybe the Chinese, behind the scenes, and we know that the Chinese are a big factor. North Korea, yay, good on you. Iran, yeah, good on you there. Belarus, well, there's another heavy hitter. The fact of the matter here is that Russia's relatively economically isolated, and that with their oil revenues drop by half, which is what it's projected to be by the end of the year, and if that projected drop in oil revenues lasts till the spring, what saves Vladimir Putin then is if the U.S. reverses its sanctions on Russian oil companies. If the U.S. does that, he gets another lifeline for the invasion. Watch J.D. Vance. It used to be Trump was Putin's savior. Now it's J.D. Vance. But if J.D. doesn't come in there and force the reversal of the sanctions, and I don't think he can because of Congress, 6 months.
Well, Professor Scott Lucas, founder and editor of EA Worldview, thank you very much for joining me again on Frontline.
Thank you, Louis. Have a great holiday season.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, or you can also sign up for a membership where you'll get exclusive content and access to videos earlier than you would otherwise. And remember, for the latest news and analysis, you can read The Times at thetimes.com, or you can listen to Times Radio. And if you want to hear more from Frontline, you can also hear us in podcast form. Just look for Times Radio's Frontline wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks very much. Goodbye.